Before there were maps, there was the sea. And before the sea had edges, there was what lived inside it. The ancient Greeks were not a people who feared the unknown quietly. They gave it a name. They gave it a shape. They gave it teeth and scales and a hunger that no shoreline could satisfy. And from the deepest imaginings of the ancient Mediterranean world, they gave rise to one of mythology's most enduring and haunting creations. A creature so vast, so primordial, so utterly beyond the comprehension of mortal sailors, that a single word was needed to contain it. That word was Ketos. Say it slowly. Let it settle. Ketos. In the original Greek, it means simply sea monster, but that translation does it no justice whatsoever. A sea monster implies something that startles you from the water. The Ketos was something altogether different. It was not a creature that lurked beneath the waves. The Ketos was the deep. It was the ocean's darkest answer to the question human beings have always been afraid to ask. What if something down there is older than we are, larger than we can conceive, and completely indifferent to our survival? The Ketos did not originate from a single myth or a single storyteller. It emerged slowly, the way great fears always do, accumulating across centuries of oral tradition, woven into the great epics, the tragic plays, the coastal folklore of a civilization that depended on the sea for its commerce, its expansion, and its very identity. The creature appears in the works of Hesiod, who wrote of the sea-born children of Phorcys and Ceto, a divine lineage of oceanic terror that included the Gorgons, the Graeae, and creatures whose names still echo through Western literature thousands of years later. Ceto herself, the goddess whose very name is the feminine form of Ketos, was the mother of monsters, the embodiment of the ocean's capacity for horror. But it was in the story of Perseus and Andromeda that the Ketos stepped fully into the light, or rather, fully into the dark waters of myth where it belonged. The tale is as dramatic as anything the ancient world ever produced. Cassiopeia, queen of Ethiopia, commits the particular kind of pride that the Greeks considered the most dangerous sin of all, she boasts. She declares that her daughter Andromeda is more beautiful than the Nereids, the divine sea nymphs who attend to Poseidon himself. The sea god's fury is immediate and absolute. He does not send a storm. He does not raise the tides. He sends the Ketos, the creature that rose from the water to devastate the Ethiopian coast, was not a beast to be reasoned with or bargained away. Ancient sources describe it variously as serpentine and whale-like, a fusion of the ocean's most terrifying qualities given singular, purposeful form. It ravaged coastlines. It capsized ships. It demanded tribute in the form of flesh. And the flesh the gods ultimately demanded for its satisfaction was Andromeda herself, chained to a sea cliff as an offering. There she waited, the sea churning below her, the shadow of something enormous moving through the water, until Perseus arrived, looked down into those depths, and chose to fight. The power attributed to the Ketos across Greek mythology was not merely physical, though the physical dimension was staggering enough. This was a creature capable of ravaging entire kingdoms, a creature dispatched by Poseidon, god of the sea, earthquakes and storms, as his chosen instrument of divine punishment. To be targeted by the Ketos was not simply to face a dangerous animal. It was to face the wrath of the ocean itself, made flesh, given direction, and sent directly for you. Sailors who encountered what they believed to be such a creature in open water understood that their only reasonable response was prayer. And yet, across all of this, the creature was never merely a villain. It was a force, a boundary marker between the human world and the divine one. That distinction matters. The Greeks were sophisticated myth-makers. They understood that the most powerful monsters in their stories were not simply obstacles for heroes to overcome. They were philosophical statements about the nature of the world. The Ketos declared, with every wave it displaced and every vessel it swallowed, that the sea belonged to something older and larger than humanity. That civilization was a thin and fragile arrangement built at the very edge of an abyss. That what lay beyond the harbor was not merely dangerous, it was genuinely, profoundly unknowable. Over the centuries, the Ketos drifted from Greek shores into Roman storytelling as the Cetus, lending its name to the constellation Cetus, the whale, still visible in the autumn sky to this day. It breathed life into the Leviathan of Hebrew scripture, into the great sea beasts of medieval cartography, into the whales of Herman Melville, and arguably into every deep-sea horror that has ever unsettled a cinema audience in the dark. The word itself became the root of cetacean, the scientific classification for whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Every time a marine biologist uses that word, they are, without perhaps realizing it, speaking the name of the most feared sea monster in Western history. In the segments that follow, we will travel deeper into the world of the Ketos, through the myths that defined it, the civilizations it shaped, the waters it was said to haunt, and the question that every sailor worth their salt eventually asked themselves when the wind died and the water went black beneath the hull. But first, take a breath, look out toward the horizon, and consider that what the ancient Greeks knew, and what we have perhaps allowed ourselves to forget, is that the sea has never been empty. It has only ever been patient. To understand the Ketos, truly understand it, not merely fear it, you must first understand where it came from. Because in Greek mythology, a creature's parentage was never incidental. It was everything. Bloodline was destiny. Bloodline was power. And the bloodline from which the Ketos descended was perhaps the most extraordinary, most unsettling family tree in the entire catalogue of ancient myth. We begin at the very beginning, not with Zeus, not with the Olympians, not with the bright and quarrelsome gods who governed the human world from their mountain throne. We begin somewhere older and deeper than all of that, in the age before Olympus, when the world was still finding its shape, and the sea was a living, breathing, sovereign thing that owed allegiance to no one. In the earliest Greek cosmologies, the ocean was not merely a feature of the world. It was a god, Oceanus. The great river that the Greeks believed encircled the entire known earth, was among the first titans, born directly from chaos and the primordial night. He was ancient beyond reckoning, vast beyond imagining, and largely content to remain at the edges of things, flowing in his eternal circle while the younger gods waged their wars and built their civilizations on the land he surrounded. He was the original sea, boundless, patient, and fundamentally unknowable. But Oceanus was orderly, as rivers are orderly. He had banks, however distant. What the Greeks also needed, in their mythology as in their imagination, was a version of the sea that was not orderly. A version that was dark and deep and hostile. A version of the ocean that did not circle the world gently but lurked beneath its surface, coiled in the trenches, waiting. For that, they needed a different divine family entirely. They needed Phorcys and Ceto. Phorcys, sometimes spelled Phorcys, was a primordial sea god, son of Pontus and Gaia, the sea itself and the earth, two of the oldest forces in the Greek universe. His domain was not the sunlit shallows or the traveled shipping lanes. He was the god of the hidden dangers of the deep, of the things beneath the surface that sailors could not see and could not prepare for. Ancient sources describe him as an old man of the sea, grey and ancient, whose skin was dusted with the silver white of sea foam and whose hands were roughened like the hide of a crustacean. He was not a figure of wrath. He was something quieter and more unsettling than that. He was the personification of the ocean's secrets. the knowledge that the water hides more than it reveals, and that what it hides is not nothing. His consort, and in some accounts his sister, in keeping with the ancient tradition of divine siblings as divine partners, was Ceto. And it is here that we arrive at the heart of our story, because Ceto's very name, in ancient Greek, is the feminine form of Ketos. She was not merely the mother of sea monsters, she was their essence. She was the concept of the oceanic beast made divine and given a face, described variously as beautiful and terrible, as a goddess whose form merged the human and the monstrous in ways that ancient artists spent centuries trying and largely failing to resolve. She was the sea's capacity for horror, dressed in a goddess's skin. Together, Phorcys and Ceto produced a family of children whose names read like a catalogue of everything the ancient Greeks most deeply feared. This was not coincidence. This was theology, in a culture that explained the world through divine genealogy. Saying that all oceanic terror shared a single mother and father was a profound statement. It meant that fear of the deep was not random. It was organized. It had a source, and that source was divine. Consider the Gorgons first, and consider them carefully, because they are far more than the story of Medusa tends to suggest. The Gorgons were three sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and the youngest and most famous, Medusa. Two of them were immortal. One was not, which was, of course, the detail that Perseus would eventually exploit. They were winged, serpent-haired, and possessed of a gaze that turned living flesh to stone. They did not hunt. They did not pursue. They simply existed in their cave at the edge of the world, and what approached them died, as daughters of Ceto, of the oceanic mother. Their power was an oceanic power, passive, absolute, and indifferent. The sea does not chase you. It simply receives you when you fall into it. Then there were the Grey-Eye, the Grey Ones, three sisters of a different, stranger kind, old from birth, grey-haired and grey-skinned from the very moment they drew their first breath. They shared between them only 2 eyes and 1 tooth, passing these between themselves as required. They were the guardians of their monstrous sisters, positioned at the threshold that separated the human world from the place where the Gorgons waited. Perseus famously stole their shared eye mid-pass, demanding directions to the Gorgons' lair as ransom for its return. They are, in their way, one of the most quietly disturbing images in all of Greek myth. 3 ancient women sharing sensation, guarding a darkness they themselves cannot fully see. But it is Echidna who deserves particular attention in any serious account of this family, because Echidna, the so-called mother of monsters, extended the bloodline of Phorcys and Ceto further than any of her siblings. Half woman, half serpent, beautiful above the waist and coiled and scaled below it, Echidna dwelt in a cave beneath the earth and mated with Typhon, the most catastrophic monster in all of Greek mythology, a being so dangerous that even the Olympian gods fled from him. Their union produced children, whose names are the most recognizable in all of Western fantasy: the Linnaean Hydra, the Nemean lion, Cerberus, the 3-headed dog of the underworld, the Chimera, the Sphinx, Orthrus, the very monsters that defined the heroic age, the creatures that the great heroes were sent to defeat, to prove their worth, to earn their place in legend, all of them traceable through Echidna and her parentage, back to Phorcys and Ceto, back to the sea, back to the deep. And then there is Scylla, perhaps the most directly relevant of all Ceto's children to our central creature, because Scylla was herself a Ketos made particular. Originally, in at least some accounts, a beautiful sea nymph, she was transformed by jealousy, by divine poison, by the particular cruelty that Greek myth reserved for those caught between the desires of more powerful beings, into a monster of the straits. Her lower body became a writhing ring of 6 dog heads on long serpentine necks, each head equipped with 3 rows of teeth. She dwelt in a sea cave above a narrow channel, and she reached down and plucked sailors from passing ships with the casual efficiency of a man picking fruit. Homer places her in the Strait of Messina, the narrow water between Sicily and the Italian mainland, and ships that passed through that strait faced her on one side and the whirlpool Charybdis on the other. There was no safe passage. There was only the choice of how you preferred to be destroyed. What is remarkable about all of these children, the Gorgons, the Grei, Echidna, Scylla, and the Ketos itself, is how coherently they express a single worldview. The Greeks who built this mythology were a seafaring people who understood, from direct and often fatal experience, that the ocean was not neutral. They had watched it take ships. They had watched it take men. They had sat on cliff tops and watched the water move in ways that suggested intelligence, purpose, intention, and what their mythology gave them was not merely an explanation for that malevolence. It gave them a family portrait. It gave the ocean's dangers a shared origin, a shared nature, and therefore a kind of terrible comprehensibility. You could not defeat the sea, but if you understood that its horrors were the children of Phorcys and Ceto, that they came from somewhere, that they had been born, then perhaps the world was not entirely chaotic. Perhaps the darkness had a shape. Perhaps it had, in the deepest possible sense, a mother. And that mother's name meant sea monster. Her children were the proof of it. And the greatest of those children, the creature dispatched by gods, the beast that swallowed coastlines whole, the shadow that moved through the water beneath the feet of the bravest heroes the ancient world ever produced, was the Ketos, born of the abyss, sent from the abyss, and always, in the end, returning to it. Perseus, Heracles, and the great confrontations that defined the Ketos in the ancient imagination. A myth is not simply a story. That distinction matters enormously, and it is one that the Greeks understood better than almost any culture before or since. A story entertains. A myth explains. A myth does the work that science and philosophy have not yet arrived to do. It takes the raw, unprocessed terror of human experience and gives it structure, consequence, and meaning. And when the Greeks needed to explain what it felt like to stand at the edge of the sea and understand, truly understand, that something immense and hostile lived inside it, they reached for the Ketos. They built myths around it. And those myths were among the most enduring, most dramatically charged, and most psychologically resonant stories the ancient world ever produced. There are 3 encounters with the Ketos that tower above all others in the surviving record. 3 confrontations between the creature and the mortal world that illuminate from different angles exactly what the beast represented and why it was the god of the sea who chose to send it. Each myth is its own world. Each one repays attention, and taken together, they compose something very close to a complete portrait of what the Ketos meant to the people who believed in it. The first myth, Perseus, Andromeda, and the cliff at Joppa. We have touched on this story before, in broad strokes, as it deserves. Now it is time to slow down and walk through it properly, because the details of this myth are where all of its real power lives. The kingdom of Ethiopia, in the Greek mythological geography, was a land at the edge of the known world, a place where the sun rose and where the gods themselves were said to visit for banquets, because the Ethiopians were considered exceptionally righteous and beloved of the divine. It was, in other words, precisely the kind of place whose destruction would carry maximum dramatic and theological weight. When Poseidon sent the Ketos against Ethiopia's coastline, he was not punishing a corrupt or wicked people. He was punishing a proud queen, and that distinction was everything. Cassiopeia's boast that Andromeda surpassed the Nereids in beauty was an act of hubris with specific targets. The Nereids were the 50 daughters of the sea god Nereus, divine beings who attended Poseidon and moved through his underwater kingdom with all the grace and authority of royalty. To claim that a mortal girl outshone them was not merely vanity. It was an insult delivered directly to the court of the sea. And the sea, as the Greeks never tired of demonstrating, did not absorb insults quietly. The Ketos came ashore. Or rather, it began working at the shoreline, which, in some ancient accounts, is perhaps more terrifying than a single dramatic beaching. It did not appear once and announce itself. It worked. It was systematic. It capsized fishing vessels. It drove whales and schools of fish away from Ethiopian waters, starving the coastal communities. It smashed seawalls. It took livestock that grazed too close to the tide line. It was a sustained, relentless campaign of oceanic devastation, and it continued until the king of Ethiopia, Cepheus, Cassiopeia's husband, consulted the oracle of Ammon, who delivered the verdict with the clean cruelty that oracles always favored. The only remedy was to sacrifice Andromeda to the creature, chain her to the sea cliff. Let the beast take her. And perhaps the ocean's appetite would be satisfied. What happened next has been painted, sculpted, written, and reimagined so many thousands of times across Western art that it risks becoming familiar, which is a fate this story does not deserve, because what it describes is genuinely extraordinary. Perseus, returning from his mission to retrieve Medusa's head, looked down from above, flying on his winged sandals, gifted by Hermes, and saw Andromeda chained to the rock, saw the water moving below her with that particular purposeful heaviness that meant the creature was close, and made a choice that most reasonable people, presented with the same information, would not have made. The battle that followed is described differently across the ancient sources, and that variation is itself illuminating. In some accounts, Perseus uses the Gorgon's head, holding Medusa's severed face toward the rising Ketos and turning it to stone where it emerged from the water. In others, he draws his sword and fights the creature directly, plunging into the sea on its back, stabbing at the joints of its scales where they were softest, fighting for so long that his winged sandals became waterlogged, and he was forced to find a sea rock to stand on mid-battle, hacking at the creature from there. In Ovid's later Latin retelling, the most elaborate surviving account, the fight lasts long enough for the water to run red, for the creature to thrash and breach and thrash again, for Perseus to take wounds before delivering the fatal blow somewhere near the base of the creature's skull, where the armored hide gave way to something softer and more vulnerable beneath. What every version agrees on is this: the Ketos was not easily killed. This was not a quick death. This was a prolonged, costly, genuinely dangerous engagement between a creature of divine origin and the most gifted hero of his generation. A man equipped with divine weapons, divine guidance, and the severed head of a Gorgon. And it was still, in every account, close. That detail alone tells us more about how the Greeks conceptualized the Ketos than any physical description could. It was not merely large, it was formidable in a way that made even the equipped and favored struggle. The second myth, Heracles and the rescue of Hesione at Troy, less celebrated than the story of Perseus and Andromeda, but in many ways more instructive about the Ketos as a theological instrument, is the myth of Heracles and Hesione, a story set in Troy long before the Trojan War, in the time of Troy's founding king, Laomedon. Laomedon was, by any standard of ancient Greek moral accounting, a profoundly foolish man. He had already, by the time the Ketos enters his story, managed to cheat both Apollo and Poseidon simultaneously. The two gods had come to him in mortal disguise and offered their labor in building Troy's famous walls in exchange for an agreed payment. Laomedon accepted their labor, took their walls, and then refused to pay. This is the kind of decision that tends not to end well in Greek mythology, and it did not end well here. Poseidon's response was the Ketos. Again, as with Ethiopia, Not a single dramatic assault, but an ongoing campaign of oceanic devastation. A sea monster that ravaged the Trojan coast, sank ships, destroyed the fishing economy that the city depended upon, and created the same grim arithmetic that had faced King Cepheus, an oracle, a verdict, a daughter, Hesione, Laomedon's own child, chained to the rocks at Troy's shoreline, offered to the creature in the hope that its appetite, satisfied by one life, would leave the rest of the kingdom in peace. Heracles was passing through at the time. Heracles was always passing through. His mythology is essentially a series of catastrophic problems that he happened to be walking past and decided, with characteristic immodesty, to solve. He made Laomedon an offer. He would kill the Ketos and rescue Hesione in exchange for the king's famous divine horses, a gift from Zeus himself. Laomedon agreed. Heracles, in the account preserved by several ancient writers, was actually swallowed by the creature, entering its body through its open jaws as it rose from the water, and then cutting his way out from the inside, killing it from within. It took 3 days. He emerged from the carcass alive, but having lost all the hair from his head through the heat of the creature's interior. Laomedon, predictably, then refused to pay again. He offered Heracles inferior horses, substitutes, instead of the promised divine ones. Heracles left. He would return later with an army, and he would sack Troy, and he would give Hesione to his companion Telamon as a war prize. But all of that comes later, and all of it flows in the mythological logic of cause and consequence, from the moment a king decided to cheat the sea god, and the sea god sent what he always sent when someone required a lesson large enough to be unmistakable. The deeper pattern, what the myths are really about. Step back from both stories for a moment, from the sea cliffs and the chains and the heroes with their divine weapons, and a pattern emerges that is impossible to ignore once you see it. In both the myth of Perseus and the myth of Heracles, the Ketos is not the central moral agent. It is the instrument of one. Poseidon sends it. The creature does not choose its targets or harbor its own grudges. It arrives where it is pointed, and it destroys what it is sent to destroy, with the methodical efficiency of a divine enforcement mechanism rather than the random violence of a predatory animal. This is a crucial distinction. It means that in the Greek mythological imagination, the Ketos occupied a very specific role. It was the physical form that divine punishment took, when that punishment needed to be oceanic, sustained, and public. When a god wished to make an example, not of a single person, but of a kingdom, a coastline, a civilization built at the water's edge. The Ketos was the chosen means. It was not a monster in the way that Medusa or the Minotaur was a monster, existing as a hazard to be navigated. It was a weapon, a living, breathing, scaled, and catastrophically powerful instrument of divine will, deployed against those who had offended the sea on its own terms. And it is that quality, the deliberateness of it, the sense that it came from somewhere specific and was sent for a reason, that made the Ketos, for the ancient Greeks, so much more frightening than any mere animal could ever be. A storm you could perhaps survive through seamanship and luck. A reef you could perhaps avoid with good charts and careful pilots. But a creature sent directly by Poseidon himself, with a specific target and unlimited patience. There was no seamanship for that. There was only sacrifice, prayer, and the desperate hope that a hero happened to be flying past at the right moment. Most of the time, of course, no hero was. Most of the time, the sea kept what the sea took, and everyone who lived within sight of the water understood that, on some level, as the deepest and most irreducible truth of their world, there is a particular kind of problem that confronts any artist who attempts to depict the unimaginable. And the Greeks, who were among the most gifted visual artists and storytellers the ancient world ever produced, ran directly into it every time they tried to give the Ketos a body. The creature lived in its natural habitat, in the space between what the eye had seen and what the mind could conceive. It was too large to be observed whole. It was too ancient to fit neatly into any existing category of animal. It was, by its very nature, a composite, a thing assembled from the ocean's most extreme qualities and given a single, sovereign form. And so when the poets described it, and the sculptors carved it, and the painters rendered it on the red-figured pottery that now sits in the quiet cases of museums across the world, what they produced was not a consistent, agreed-upon creature. What they produced was a family of desperate approximations, each one reaching towards something that the human visual vocabulary did not quite have the tools to capture. That struggle, honest, earnest, and ultimately illuminating, is the subject of this segment, because the way a culture tries to depict what it fears tells you almost as much about that culture as the fear itself does. And what the Greeks reached for, again and again, when they tried to give the Ketos a face, reveals something profound about how they understood the boundary between the known world and the one that lay beneath the water's surface. The poetic record, the earliest and in some ways most honest descriptions of the Ketos, come from the poets, precisely because poetry is under no obligation to be internally consistent. A poet can describe something as simultaneously enormous and fast, armored and fluid, serpentine and whale-like, without the image collapsing under its own contradictions. The visual artist does not have that luxury. The poet can gesture at a thing without being required to draw it. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, does not describe the Ketos in precise physical terms. He is more interested in its genealogy and its divine significance than in its anatomy. But the language he uses around the children of Phorcys and Ceto is consistently one of overwhelming, abnormal scale. These are creatures that exceed natural proportion. They are not simply large versions of things that exist. They are categorically different from the world of measurable, bounded creatures. They belong to a register of being that the ordinary Greek vocabulary of animal life was not designed to address. Ovid, writing several centuries later in his Metamorphoses, gives us the most extended poetic engagement with the creature in any surviving ancient text. And it is revealing in its choices. His Ketos in the Perseus story surfaces like a reef breaking the waterline, vast and unhurried. He describes its chest and forward body as mountainous, using the Latin word for mountain, mons, in the specific context of describing the creature's emergence from the sea, as though what was rising from the water was not a living thing but a geological event. Its wake, he notes, throws water in every direction like a storm front, and yet Ovid also gives it breath, hot, expelled in great jets, the way a whale breathes, which anchors the creature in the biological world just enough to make it viscerally real rather than merely symbolic. It is this quality, the oscillation between the geological and the biological, that makes Ovid's Ketos so effectively horrifying. It is too big to be just an animal. It is too alive to be just a metaphor. The visual record. When we turn from the poets to the visual artists, the vase painters, the relief sculptors, the mosaic workers, we encounter something genuinely fascinating, a creature that across 5 centuries of Greek and Roman artistic production never settled into a single agreed-upon form, and yet never strayed very far from a particular cluster of visual ideas. The Ketos on ancient pottery and stone is recognizable as a family of images, even when no two individual depictions are identical. It is as though the artistic tradition reached a collective agreement about the creature's essential qualities without ever quite managing to agree on the specifics. The most consistent element across virtually all surviving visual depictions is the head. The Ketos, in ancient art, almost universally possesses the head of a dog. or in some cases, something between a dog and a wolf, with a long, heavy muzzle, large, flared nostrils, and ears that lie flat against the skull, in the manner of an animal prepared to fight or to lunge. This canine head sits atop a neck that rapidly widens and thickens as it descends toward the body, as though the creature's proportions expand dramatically from the point where the head ends. Some depictions show the neck itself as serpentine, capable of coiling or arching, which gives the creature a reaching quality, a sense that it can extend itself toward whatever it is, targeting with something more purposeful than simple forward movement. The body, in the majority of depictions, is where the creature departs most dramatically from any single animal analogy. It is almost always rendered as a fish body, scaled, tapered, fitted with large fins, but of a scale that exceeds any fish the Mediterranean world would have produced. In many vase paintings, it is so large relative to the ships and human figures depicted alongside it that the effect is almost abstract. The creature is not swimming near the ship. It is simply present in the same water, and the ship is incidental. Some depictions show the body coiling back on itself in great loops, the way a conger eel coils in the water, which would imply a length that the available canvas of a pottery vessel cannot actually accommodate, and which the artist is therefore gesturing toward rather than depicting. What is particularly striking about the canine head, once you notice it, is how consistent it is across otherwise very different artistic traditions and time periods. A Greek vase from the 5th century BCE and a Roman mosaic from the 2nd century CE will differ enormously in style, technique, and artistic ambition, but both will give their Ketos that same heavy-jawed, dog-like face. There is an argument that this reflects the ancient observation that very large sea creatures, particularly whales, which the Mediterranean world encountered with some regularity, possessed heads with a blunt, almost mammalian quality that distinguished them from ordinary fish. The canine head may therefore be, at least in part, the ancient artist's attempt to encode the biological reality of the whale into a mythological creature. This thing has a warm-blooded face. It breathes. It is not a fish. It is something older and more terrible than a fish. Scale and the failure of measurement. Perhaps the most instructive thing about the ancient visual record of the Ketos is what it consistently refuses to do. It refuses to give the creature a definitive size. This is not a failure of imagination or technical ability. The Greeks were perfectly capable of depicting scale relationships with great precision when they wanted to. What the refusal to fix the Ketos at a specific size represents is, I would argue, a deliberate artistic choice and a theologically informed one. A creature of fixed, knowable dimensions is a creature that can, in principle, be measured. And a creature that can be measured can be understood. And a creature that can be understood can, in the fullness of time, be defeated, not just by a hero with divine weapons, but conceptually, by knowledge itself. The Ketos was not supposed to be that kind of creature. It was supposed to be the kind whose approach could be felt before it was seen, whose mass displaced enough water to change the behavior of the waves around a vessel, whose shadow moved beneath a hull for an unsettling length of time before resolving into something with a head and a direction. It was supposed to be the kind of creature that, when it finally surfaced, was larger than you had prepared yourself for, even knowing it was coming. The Romans, inheriting the Greek creature wholesale through their absorption of Greek mythology and artistic tradition, added one further visual element that deserves note. In Roman mosaic work, particularly in the elaborate floor mosaics of wealthy bathhouses and dining rooms, where sea creature imagery was fashionable and extensively developed, the Ketos is frequently depicted with a kind of dorsal spine or crest running from the base of its neck along the upper body, a ridge of raised, hardened scales that gives the creature a silhouette even more imposing than the body alone would suggest. This is an addition that has no clear precedent in Greek visual tradition. and it may reflect the Roman encounter with different marine fauna, particularly in the Atlantic, where Roman naval activity brought them into contact with larger and more dramatically proportioned sea life than the Mediterranean typically produced. The creature kept growing across the centuries because the ocean kept revealing that it was larger than anyone had previously assumed. And that, perhaps, is the most honest thing that can be said about the physical form of the Ketos across the full span of ancient artistic and literary engagement with it. It was not a fixed, agreed-upon thing. It was a living cultural response to a living cultural fear. And as the world of the ancient Mediterranean expanded, as Greek and then Roman maritime activity pushed into wider and stranger waters, as the ocean kept demonstrating that it contained things larger and more extraordinary than the previous generation's imagination had accommodated, the Ketos grew with it. Each generation of artists and poets received the creature from the generation before them, and each added something, a detail, a dimension, a quality that the version they had inherited had not quite managed to capture. The result, across 500 years of continuous artistic engagement, was not a single coherent monster, but a tradition of reaching, an ongoing collective human attempt to draw something that the sea had never quite agreed to hold still long enough to be properly seen. Some traditions never quite get resolved. Some monsters never quite come into focus. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Most myths age. They belong to the world that made them. They carry the fingerprints of a particular time, a particular people, a particular set of anxieties that the centuries eventually dissolve. But some myths are made of sterner material. Some myths attach themselves to something so fundamental in the human experience that no amount of time, no shift in theology or science or culture can fully dislodge them. They travel. They translate. They arrive in new centuries wearing new clothes, speaking new languages, answering to new names, but underneath all of that, the original shape remains. The Ketos is one of these. What was born in the imagination of the ancient Greeks did not die with the ancient Greeks. It migrated, slowly, steadily, across 2,500 years of Western history, and the trail it left behind is longer and more surprising than almost anyone who has not looked closely at it would expect. To follow that trail is to discover something quietly astonishing, that the single creature born from the union of Phorcys and Ceto, dispatched by Poseidon against the coastlines of the ancient Mediterranean, never really left the Western imagination at all. It simply kept changing its name. Into Rome. The first great migration was the most straightforward. As Rome absorbed the Greek world, politically, militarily, and above all culturally, it absorbed its mythology with a thoroughness that amounted to wholesale adoption. The Greek gods became Roman gods with new names but largely identical portfolios. Poseidon became Neptune, the Nereids became the Nereids, and the Ketos became the Cetus, a Latin transliteration so close to the original that it barely counts as a translation at all. The Romans kept the creature's essential character intact. It remained a sea beast of divine scale, dispatched by the sea god as an instrument of punishment, subdued by heroes of exceptional courage. Ovid's retelling of the Perseus story in the Metamorphoses, the most elaborate surviving ancient account of the creature in action, is a Roman text, written in Latin, and it is Ovid who gives us the most cinematically detailed rendering of the battle at the sea cliff. But Rome added something to the creature's cultural life that Greece had not fully managed. It made the Ketos permanent, not merely in literature, but in the sky. Roman astronomers, working from an older Greek astronomical tradition that had begun the process of cataloguing the stars into constellations, formalized the constellation Cetus, positioning it in the autumn night sky in the southern celestial hemisphere, directly adjacent to the constellations of Perseus and Andromeda. The myth was written into the heavens. Every autumn, across the entire Mediterranean world and well beyond it, The sky rehearsed the same story. The hero, the princess, the sea beast coiling between them in the dark, but sailors navigating by the stars. Which is to say, for every sailor in the ancient world, the Ketos was not merely a story they had been told. It was a presence in the sky above their mast. It was always there, in the season when the autumn storms came and the sea grew dangerous and the water turned the color of iron into scripture. The second great migration is the one that requires the most care to trace, because it runs not through direct cultural borrowing, but through the shared deep grammar of the ancient Near East, a world in which the sea was universally coded as dangerous, divine, and morally charged long before the Greeks arrived to add their particular contribution. Hebrew scripture contains, running through several of its most ancient and powerful texts, a creature of the deep that scholars have spent centuries mapping onto the Greek Ketos with varying degrees of success and controversy. That creature is the Leviathan. The Leviathan of the Hebrew Bible is not a simple thing. It appears in different books, in Job, in Psalms, in Isaiah. And it is not entirely consistent across those appearances, which suggests that it, like the Ketos, was a creature that accumulated meaning over time rather than arriving fully formed from a single theological source. In the book of Job, it is described at extraordinary length, the longest description of any creature in the Hebrew Bible, as a being of such power and such impenetrability that only God himself can approach it without fear. Its hide cannot be pierced by harpoon or spear. Its breath produces smoke. Fire comes from its mouth. The water boils in its wake. It is, in Job's account, the supreme argument for divine power. If you cannot face this creature, the text implies, then perhaps reconsider your confidence in your ability to comprehend the intentions of the God who made it. The parallels with the Ketos are real and deep, even if the lines of direct influence are difficult to draw with precision. Both creatures inhabit the sea as their natural domain. Both are associated with divine power rather than opposed to it. They are instruments or embodiments of divine will, not simply animals. Both are creatures whose primary function in the texts that describe them is to demonstrate the absolute smallness of human power when set against the forces that govern the deep. And both, crucially, are creatures that no ordinary mortal weapon can meaningfully threaten. The convergence may reflect shared Mesopotamian mythological sources, the ancient Babylonian sea dragon Tiamat, from whom both traditions may have drawn, or it may reflect the simple fact that civilizations built near the sea independently arrive at similar conclusions about what lives inside it. Either way, the family resemblance is unmistakable. On to the maps. The medieval world inherited the Ketos through two channels simultaneously, through the Christian tradition that absorbed the Hebrew Leviathan and transformed it into a symbol of Satan and the chaos of the deep, and through the classical tradition that monastic scholars preserved, imperfectly, selectively, but persistently, in the manuscripts that survived the fall of Rome. What the medieval imagination did with this dual inheritance was to project it outward onto the blank spaces of an expanding world. As European sailors began, in the late medieval period, to push beyond the familiar waters of the Mediterranean and the northern European coastlines into genuinely unknown ocean, the cartographers who attempted to map those waters faced the same problem that the Greek visual artists had faced. How do you represent what you do not know? Their answer, arrived at consistently across the great tradition of medieval and early modern cartography, was to populate the blank spaces with sea monsters. The Carta Marina tradition, elaborate, illustrated sea charts that depicted the known world surrounded by increasingly speculative ocean, placed creatures of extraordinary variety and invention in the waters beyond the edges of knowledge. These creatures were not invented from nothing. They were assembled, consciously and unconsciously, from the accumulated tradition of oceanic terror that ran back through the medieval Leviathan. through the Roman Cetus, through the Greek Ketos, and arrived on the cartographer's desk as a living vocabulary of deep-sea dread. The sea monsters of Olaus Magnus, whose great 1539 Carta Marina depicted the waters around Scandinavia teeming with creatures of baroque and terrifying invention, are recognizably in conversation with the creature that Ovid had described 1500 years earlier. The canine head, the coiling serpentine body, the sense of something present in the water that is far larger than the vessel above it. Into literature and into science. And then, in 1851, something extraordinary happened. An American writer named Herman Melville published a novel about a whaling ship, a white sperm whale, and a captain whose obsession with that whale consumed his life, his crew, and finally himself. Moby Dick is many things: a philosophical novel, a technical manual of the 19th century whaling industry, a meditation on fate and free will and the nature of evil. But it is also, at its deepest structural level, a retelling of the Ketos myth. Melville knew his classics, he knew his Bible, he knew the tradition he was writing inside, and he folded it into his novel with deliberate, scholarly care. The white whale is divine in the way the Ketos is divine, not literally a god, but an instrument of something larger than the human world can comfortably accommodate. Captain Ahab is a hero in the Greek mode, gifted, driven, ultimately destroyed, not by cowardice, but by the particular hubris of believing that his personal grievance against the universe was a grievance the universe was obligated to answer. And the ocean, in Melville's vision, is exactly what it was in Hesiod's: a sovereign, indifferent, ancient force that does not register human suffering as a thing worth adjusting its behavior for. The line from the Ketos to Moby Dick is not metaphorical. It is genealogical. The white whale is the Ketos' great-great-grandchild, dressed in the language of 19th century American prose, and fitted with the specific horror of the industrial age. The horror that we had, by 1851, developed the technology to hunt these creatures at scale, and that the creatures had not become any less terrifying for it. And yet the most quietly remarkable legacy of the Ketos is not in literature at all. It is in science. When the Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century was developing the taxonomic system that still organizes all of biological knowledge today, he needed a name for the order of marine mammals: the whales, the dolphins, the porpoises. He reached, as classically educated Europeans of his era invariably did, for the ancient Greek. He called them cetacea, from Cetus, from Ketos, from Ceto, the goddess whose name meant sea monster and whose children were the horrors of the deep. Every time a marine biologist classifies a blue whale, a bottlenose dolphin, a beluga, or a narwhal, every time a conservation report refers to cetacean populations, every time a nature documentary uses the word, they are speaking, without knowing it, the name of the most feared creature in ancient mythology. The science of the living ocean runs on a word that was coined in terror, by people who looked at the water and understood, in their bones, that what lived inside it was something they could neither fully see nor fully imagine. 2,500 years later, the name of the sea monster is the name that science gave to the whale. The Ketos never left. We simply stopped recognizing it. That is the measure of a true myth, not how many people believe it, but how deeply it has embedded itself into the structures of the world, into the language we use without thinking, the sky we navigate by without remembering what we named its stars for, the fears we carry without being quite sure where we first picked them up. The Ketos is in all of those places. It has been there, patient and enormous and dark, for as long as we have had words for the sea. And it will be there, in one form or another, for as long as the sea continues to hold things we cannot see, which, as any honest oceanographer will tell you, is most of it. Every great monster story, if it is honest, eventually arrives at the same question. Not the question of what the creature means, or where it came from, or how the ancient world understood its power. Those are the questions of scholars and priests and philosophers, the question that the rest of us, the sailors, the navigators, the people with calloused hands and practical minds who actually had to live on the water, eventually get around to asking is considerably more direct. If it is real, and it is coming, then what do you do about it? What, in precise and operational terms, does it take to kill something like this? Not a hero with divine weapons and the favor of the gods. Not Perseus with his winged sandals and his borrowed shield and Medusa's severed head in a bag. An ordinary crew, an ordinary ship. The weapons that actually existed in the actual world during the age when men sailed wooden vessels across open ocean and understood from hard experience that the sea was perfectly willing to kill them in ways that no map had yet bothered to record. It is a question worth taking seriously, because the golden age of piracy, that extraordinary, violent, and strangely fascinating period, stretching roughly from the 1650s to the 1730s, when the Caribbean and the Atlantic trade routes were contested by some of the most capable and desperate sailors the world has ever produced, was also the age when human beings first developed the sustained naval firepower to make this question something other than purely theoretical. The weapons existed by then that had not existed in Perseus's time. The question is whether they would have been enough. Let us think about this carefully, and let us begin not with the weapons but with the creature, because before you can kill something you need to understand it. And understanding the Ketos, as a practical, tactical problem rather than a mythological one, reveals immediately that this was never going to be a straightforward engagement. The tactical problem, the Ketos, as established across every ancient account, was a creature of extraordinary armor. Its scales were not merely decorative, they were structural, layered, overlapping in the manner of plate armor rather than fish scales, hardened to a degree that ordinary iron weapons could not penetrate. Ovid tells us this explicitly in his account of the Perseus battle. The hero's sword found purchase only at the specific joints between scale plates, where the hide gave way to something softer beneath. This is not a minor detail. It is a tactical specification. The creature's primary surface, the broad expanse of scaled body that would present itself to any attacking vessel, was essentially impenetrable to conventional assault. Then there is the matter of size. A pirate vessel of the Golden Age, a sloop or a brigantine, the preferred craft of the Caribbean buccaneers for their speed and shallow draft, displaced perhaps 100 to 200 tons. A larger vessel, a frigate or a ship of the line pressed into piratical service, might displace 500 to 1,000 tons. The Ketos, in the mythological record, was capable of capsizing vessels and ravaging entire coastlines through sustained physical assault. It was, in the language of naval engagement, a vessel killer. Something larger and more structurally powerful than the thing it was fighting. This is, from a tactical standpoint, a profoundly uncomfortable asymmetry. You are, in this scenario, the smaller combatant. In naval warfare, being the smaller combatant is not automatically fatal. Speed, maneuverability, and the choice of engagement distance can compensate for raw tonnage. But it means that, if the creature closes to physical contact, the engagement is essentially over. The first and most important tactical principle in any engagement with the Ketos was the same as the first principle of fighting anything vastly larger than yourself. Do not let it touch you. And then there is the question of the creature's behavior. The ancient accounts consistently describe the Ketos as a purposeful animal, not a mindless predator, but a directed one, sent with a target and willing to sustain a campaign against that target over days and weeks. It was patient. It was methodical. It did not need to breathe in the way a human combatant needs to breathe. It could stay submerged for extended periods, surfacing to strike and then withdrawing, making it almost impossible to maintain contact long enough to deliver sustained damage. Perseus's battle was protracted precisely because the creature kept breaching and diving, forcing the hero to work for every wound he inflicted. A pirate crew attempting to engage this animal would face the same problem. How do you fight something that can simply go somewhere you cannot follow, rest, and return? The weapons available. By the golden age of piracy, the naval weapons available to a well-equipped vessel represented the most powerful portable ordnance that human beings had ever constructed. The ship's cannon, in its various calibers, from the lightweight 4-pounder to the devastating 32-pounder long gun carried by major warships, was capable of delivering iron shot at velocities sufficient to punch through the oak planking of an enemy vessel at several hundred yards. These were not weapons the ancient world possessed. They were, by any pre-industrial standard, extraordinary instruments of destruction. The question is whether they were the right instruments for this particular problem. The answer, considered carefully, is partially. Cannon shot, solid iron ball, fired at high velocity, would not be deflected by scale armor the way a sword blow would be. The physics are different. A sword relies on edge and pressure applied over a small area. It can be turned by a sufficiently hard and angled surface. A cannonball delivers kinetic energy in a volume, and at a velocity that scale armor, however hardened, was not designed to absorb. At close range, within 200 yards, where a Golden Age cannon was most accurate and most powerful, a direct hit from a 12-pound or heavier shot would likely penetrate even the thickest scale plating, provided it struck at a reasonably perpendicular angle. The problem is accuracy, and the problem is exposure, the engagement, how it would actually unfold. The most credible plan for killing a Ketos in the age of piracy would have required not one ship, but two, and it would have required a degree of coordination between those two crews that most pirate companies, being by nature individualistic and financially motivated, would have found deeply uncomfortable to sustain under the particular stress of fighting something capable of sinking both of them simultaneously. The first vessel, lighter, faster, the sloop, would serve as the bait and the tracker. Its job was not to fight the creature. Its job was to stay close enough to the Ketos to maintain contact, to follow its breachings and its dives, to keep the animal's attention engaged and its direction relatively predictable. This vessel would be expendable in the strategic sense. Its crew would have known, boarding it, that they were the ones most likely to be killed. The sea, in this scenario as in all others, would take someone. The question was, who? The sloop crew would be armed with harpoons, not the small hand-thrown harpoons of the average fisherman, but the heavy, rope-attached harpoon irons used by the whaling industry. That was, by the 1680s and 1690s, developing the serious deep-water hunting techniques that would reach their apex in the following century. A harpoon buried in the creature's flesh would not injure it meaningfully, but it would attach a line. And a line meant you could feel where it was going, even when you could not see it. In the darkness of deep water, against a creature that could dive and surface unpredictably, that line would be the difference between fighting something and simply waiting to be struck by it. The second vessel, heavier, slower, carrying the serious gun deck, would hold its distance. 300 yards is too far for reliable accuracy against a moving target in open water. 100 yards is close enough to be dangerous if the creature turns. The ideal engagement distance was somewhere in that uncomfortable middle ground, close enough for the gunners to place their shot with real competence, far enough that a single breach and lunge from the Ketos would not immediately carry it over the rail. The gunners, and this is critical, would not be firing at the body. The broad, scaled flanks of the creature were the most heavily armored surface it presented, and wasting shot against them was precisely that, waste. Every ancient account that describes the creature's vulnerability agrees on the location, the base of the skull. the junction between the heavily armored body and the neck, where the scale plates must necessarily thin and flex to allow the head to move. That is where Perseus found his final target. That is where Heracles, from the inside, found the soft tissue that his sword could reach. A 12-pound iron ball, delivered accurately to that junction from 150 yards, fired from a stable gun platform by an experienced crew. This was, in the language of the golden age of sail, a shootable shot. It would not be clean. It would not be quick. It would be a long, wet, terrifying morning's work, and the outcome would remain genuinely uncertain until the very end. The honest assessment, and honesty, is what this question deserves. Is that a golden age pirate crew, well-armed, well-led, and operating with the kind of disciplined coordination that the best of them were genuinely capable of, would have had a real chance, not a comfortable chance, not the kind of chance that experienced sailors would have accepted cheerfully, knowing what they were sailing toward, but a real one. The technology had finally, across 2,500 years of human development, reached a point where a mortal crew without divine assistance could have contested this engagement and expected, if everything went correctly, to survive it, perhaps even to win. The caveat is that last phrase, if everything went correctly. At sea, in the age of sail, very few things went entirely correctly. The wind shifted, lines parted, gun carriages jammed. Men, confronted with the reality of what was rising from the water toward them, made decisions that their training had not prepared them to make calmly. And the Ketos, patient, ancient, dispatched by a god, and therefore not subject to the ordinary anxieties that governed mortal combatants, would simply have kept coming. It had been sent. It did not know how to stop having been sent. That, in the end, is what made the Ketos unlike any other enemy a pirate crew had ever faced. Every other enemy, a naval warship, a rival buccaneer, a merchant with hired guards, had their own survival to consider. Every other enemy could choose to retreat, to negotiate, to accept that the engagement had not gone their way and live to fight somewhere else. The Ketos had no such option. It was not fighting for survival or profit or pride. It was fulfilling a divine instruction, and divine instructions, in the Greek understanding of the world, did not come with provisions for renegotiation. You would have to kill it completely, or you would have to outrun it. And even then, the account of its patience in both the Perseus and Heracles myths suggests that outrunning it was not a permanent solution. It would simply wait, offshore, methodically working at the coastline until the offering was made, or the hero arrived, or the kingdom finally collapsed under the sustained pressure of having a god's instrument camped permanently in its harbors. There is something in that image. The Ketos, offshore, waiting with the calm assurance of something that has nowhere else to be and nothing else to do, that resonates far beyond the boundaries of ancient mythology. We have always known, on some level, that the sea contains things larger and older and more patient than we are. We have always understood that what lies beneath the surface of the deep water is not neutral territory. The Greeks gave that understanding a name and a family and a face, however difficult to draw, and sent it up against their greatest heroes to see how the contest would go. The heroes won, mostly, just barely, at great cost, and then they sailed home, and they looked back at the water, and they knew, as every sailor has always known, that the thing was still out there, changed perhaps, diminished perhaps, but present. It is still out there now. It has simply learned, across the long centuries, to go by other names.